Listening, learning, and focusing on the customer and the people. I think that kind of is the bedrock for my success in every role. I worked in Japan, that's very different. China's completely different. Europe, somewhat different. North America, and so on. And so, how can you be successful across all those areas? I think being self aware, being humble as a leader, listening to your people, listening to customers, tailoring your approach to each of those markets. If you do that, you're off to a good start. Now, there's more things that come after that, right? Which is how do you create a strategy to execute the market opportunity, and how do you go to market, and how do you tailor it to those markets, have the right structure, the right KPIs, and so on. But if just at the very beginning, you're just good at listening, you're curious, you're humble, you're self aware, you listen and you learn from your people and your customers, you'll start off well.
Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of the CEO Podcast. My name is Mario, your host, together with my partner, co-host, Professor Robert Hargrove, where we talk with today's CEOs on different problems, issues, challenges, and most importantly, achieving impossible futures. Today's guest, David Hewitt, CEO of Sunlight Batteries. David, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, guys.
No problem. Well, David, let's kick it off, right? So tell us a little bit about your background, your education, growing up in UK, and then moving to the US.
Yeah, I spent my early years in the UK. I spent also 5 years living in Germany because my father was in the military. So that kind of informs you on big influences in my life early on. It was my father, and it was boarding school. You often hear about the leadership in the UK being kind of created on the rugby fields in England, and to some degree, that was my early influence as well. So beyond that, my involvement in becoming a CEO was pretty early on in my career. So after a few years working in the UK at the beginning of my career, and after backpacking Asia for 6 months, I got an opportunity to work in China on a startup business, which I took on. And so that was very commercially focused because we're trying to generate market share. And as we did generate market share, then the opportunities to provide aftermarket services. And then we started to localize assembly because we had critical mass in China. And so quite early on in my career, I became a CEO slash general manager with P&L experience. And from there, my career accelerated working in Asia and then North America and in Europe in CEO roles. I've done startups, I've done turnarounds, I've done complex multi-site international businesses, and I've done it across industries and across geographies.
For me, especially when I read your profile or prepared for this was fascinating. And we can get into the backpacking thing, but you worked as a GM slash CEO in UK, in Asia, so China, Japan, and in the United States. So how does this experience influence you from a CEO point of view?
The focus, listening, learning, and focusing on the customer and the people. I think that kind of is the bedrock for my success in every role. Because especially when you're going from, I worked in Japan, that's very different. China's completely different. Europe, somewhat different. North America, and so on. And so, how can you be successful across all those areas? And I think being self aware, being humble as a leader, listening to your people, listening to customers, tailoring your approach to each of those markets. If you do that, you're off to a good start. Now, there's more things that come after that, right? Which is how do you create a strategy to execute the market opportunity, and how do you go to market, and how do you tailor it to those markets, have the right structure, the right KPIs, and so on. But if just at the very beginning, you're just good at listening, you're curious, you're humble, you're self aware, you listen and you learn from your people and your customers, you'll start off well.
That's very interesting, the humility. Talk about the importance of a new CEO or someone who's new in a CEO role. Say a little bit more about that, the humility aspect. Because you're coming in a very powerful position, the CEO, the top dog, the ace of accountability, the ultimate decision maker. So where does humility come into it?
Yeah.
The CEO of many companies is God.
Yeah. It's an interesting question. I'm taking a half step back before answering a question. I've kind of wrestled with this as a philosophy because I've seen CEOs who come in and they do act like they're God, right? very prescriptive, very directive. They don't ask a lot of questions. They're not really listening, but they're making decisions. They're being decisive and they're forcing change. And you think to yourself, well, perhaps that's the way to be. But for me, where I've landed on is particularly at the beginning, and not in perpetuity, but particularly at the beginning, you've got to be humble enough to realize you don't know it all. Like you're not an expert in every function, which is why it's important to have a strong leadership team. You don't know the local market, particularly if you're changing industries, right? You don't know the local market. There are new technologies constantly being invented, like artificial intelligence, right? Now, before that, e-commerce platforms, social media, these are all new platforms that if you're not humble enough to realize that you don't know it all, you're missing out on evolving technologies, evolving opportunities. You're missing out on being by your customer base and by your employee base, and probably missing out on motivating your workforce because you haven't got the humility to pay respect to them, to listen and to learn from them.
I imagine if I'm working for you in one of these companies, and I'm expecting you to come in and act like the top dog, the ace of accountability and ultimate decision maker, God, if you will, and you show humility, it probably is very captivating. It probably would win me over. I said, look, he's in this powerful role, but he really has a lot of humility.
And I would say liberating as well.
Yeah, I just imagine that probably has quite an impact on people.
I remember thinking early on in my career, I had kind of senior leaders, CEOs who didn't want to create a personal relationship with their workforce, didn't really want to show vulnerability, humility, because I guess they figured it would mean that the workforce wouldn't listen to them, wouldn't respect them. But actually, I found the opposite to be true. I think by having that and listening to your workforce is exactly what's described. It's very liberating and very empowering, very refreshing.
I think the problem with most companies that I've seen over the years, probably mainly big ones, is the hierarchical, bureaucratic culture, which is really stifling. So when you're in that kind of culture and the new CEO comes in and he shows up with humility, not having all the answers, asking more questions than talking, it must be very compelling in some ways.
Yeah, I would also say it's fascinating how often, by just asking lots of questions, sometimes seemingly dumb questions or basic questions, actually forces people in the room to go, actually, we don't know, or we don't understand that, right? I'm sure you've seen many occasions people in meeting rooms don't want to look silly, don't want to look stupid. They kind of nod their heads along and they leave the meeting room and they're like, I don't know what was just talked about, but they don't want to admit that. And so when the CEO is coming in and going, really stupid question, but why? What are we doing this for? Why these customers, not those customers? The amount of times it kind of forces out, we don't actually know. We've just been doing it this way for years. So there's another angle to that sort of humility and self-awareness and just asking lots of questions, is it forces people to rethink what they've been doing.
As we were having our warm-up for this call, you shared a few things about your background. I may be going in reverse chronological order, but a few things interested me. One is you went to the English public schools, private boarding school.
Yeah.
England is famous for producing great leaders for centuries. The British Empire was in a leadership position, or for lack of a better word, controlled 2/3 of the world. Many of those people went to the kinds of schools that you went to. So I'm wondering, how did your school background from these English public schools impact? Did that teach you something about leadership? And another question is, you mentioned that you would backpack to almost 50 countries. How did that influence your development as a leader? And I don't know how many companies you've been a CEO or in a high leadership role, but I'm just curious about the connections between those threads. Your background from the English public schools, which has been produced generations upon generations of extraordinary leaders, and your trekking around the world, which is probably a little bit more of a humbling experience.
Yeah. So the schooling, it was a boarding school, so I think it taught you a lot about duty, commitment, teamwork, living with these people, and competitiveness. I mean, the British schools and British boarding schools in particular, extremely performance oriented and competitive. I made the comment earlier about being kind of born on the rugby pitch.
What is the rocket pitch? What's that? Oh, rugby. Okay.
Rugby, yeah.
That's a rugby term. Yeah.
All right. Okay. All right. That's
Rug-
very interesting.
Rugby pitch, yeah. So you don't have to go to a British boarding school to get these traits, but that focus on the team, that competitiveness, that professionalism, that duty, that mental preparation, these are all skills that give you good grounding to go on and be successful in your career.
That teaches something about leadership. How do you go from being one of the boys to a leader?
So preparation and competitiveness, I think, are all transferable to leadership, but I think the focus on the team is a huge part of it. When you have a CEO who wants to win, leads by example, but really focuses on the team and winning as a team.
Beautiful. And tell us a little bit about your trekking experience.
Yeah, the backpacking, which was a lot of fun. Again, it teaches you really that you're a small fish in a big pond, and there's a lot you don't know. I think it teaches you that. It also, for me personally, taught me how fortunate we are, and then because we are so fortunate, what is that responsibility to make the most of the opportunities that we have? It teaches you resourcefulness and tenacity. I remember backpacking through Vietnam, and this was in 2007, backpacking through Vietnam and living on $10 a day, and needing to live on $10 a day because I just didn't have the money. I mean, I was having to budget pretty aggressively. And so I think being able to work to a budget, I think has stuck with me all the way.
Budgeting aggressively, to put it mildly.
Oh, yeah. I remember making the trade-off between having air conditioning and not having air conditioning, just from a budget perspective. Yeah, so good times, character building for sure.
What was your first leadership experience with respect to a company?
Yeah, so in China, and when I say leadership, I mean leadership of a team and leadership of a P&L, because prior to that, when I was in the UK, I led the launch of a new product into the UK food industry, and then they promoted me and put me in charge of creating a global distribution network. But that's leadership of a product, launching a product. My first one was in my mid-20s in China, when they asked me to get a business up and going there. And because we had quick success, we were able to scale the operations, both in terms of the number of employees, but also localizing, assembly, and then eventually manufacturing.
What was the product there?
So it was inspection equipment that goes into manufacturing lines for food, pharma, beverage, and also textiles. So looking for what we called foreign contaminants, but effectively it's pieces of metal in someone's food product or someone's apparel, or glass or ceramic as well.
Was this a British company?
It was a British company, yes.
And so they delegated the P&L, basically the CEO responsibility, to you. How old were you then?
I was 26 at the time. So it was a regional general manager role. So I was in charge of China. We had 2.5 years of very good success. And then my role expanded to be in charge of all of Asia Pacific.
How did you learn how to be a general manager? Did your previous experience lead to that? That's a pretty sophisticated job for 26.
Oh, I was well in over my head. I mean,
okay.
I'll answer the question, but I mean, to be honest with you, I was 26, no leadership experience, and China is probably the worst place to go and be a first-time general manager. I mean, China in by itself is hugely challenging.
Yeah.
Massively challenging. And so, I worked, as most entrepreneurs, kind of people starting up a business did, I worked significant hours. But to answer your question, again, I would point it back to my upbringing. I would point it to my backpacking experiences, and to the fact I just realized there was a lot I didn't know. And so I developed a very good team. I developed a very good team, and I listened to them. And obviously I was giving directions most of the times, but I've always encouraged people to kind of challenge me and give a different perspective. So that helped particularly on in my career when I was kind of learning on the job.
Well, I would say that's kind of a bread and butter of every CEO, his or her executive team, right? So this is where, if you have a micromanaging CEO who does everything, then his executive team just cannot do what they're actually here to do. And the organization is severely lagging if the CEO takes a couple of days off. So if you could tell us just a little bit of how you approach building the executive team, because that's the bread and butter of the CEO. And what are the qualities that you're looking for within the executive team members?
Yeah, I'm a very tough interviewer, as my head of HR and my recruiters will tell you, because I know how important the recruitment is. If you get it right, it's a multiplier effect. If you get it wrong, you're really constraining your growth. And so I'm very particular, but I look for extreme ownership, integrity, accountability.
The Jocko philosophy, right?
Exactly. I mean, and before I knew the term from him, just those
Yeah,
characteristics that I'm going to own it. I'm going to know my numbers. I'm going to own
yeah.
it. The buck stops with me. I will bring solutions as next to problem. And if you have that, then they don't actually even have to be a rock star. I think early in my career, I was always looking for rock stars, but I've become a little bit more flexible on that. But if you have extreme ownership, integrity, and accountability, they're going to own their function. They're going to be good peers to me, to the rest of the leadership team. They're going to be open to a challenging environment where we can each challenge each other and give different perspectives. That's what I look for, and that's what's paid dividends for my team and I.
How would you know if somebody has those three qualities that you mentioned?
Exactly my next question.
So, the integrity piece is a little harder, I think, to pick up in the interview process, but do they do what they say they're going to do when they say they're going to do it? When you ask them stories about what went wrong, what mistakes did they make, how was your relationship with your boss, what do you think about your company, you start to pick up a few things. And the same goes for extreme ownership. So, for example, like, why didn't you hit your sales numbers? Oh, well, I didn't hit my sales numbers because the operations team couldn't deliver. Okay, then that's probably an example of not extreme ownership. I mean, that might be a true statement, but really that's not extreme ownership. So I try to create a fairly kind of conversational interview process, and I will really drill deep into tell me how you did it. Tell me some examples of what happened. Tell me about the mistakes you made. I mean, I'm quite a big believer in asking more often than not, tell me about the things that you got wrong and the mistakes you made than what you got right. And I think that reveals something.
So I am curious, do you assess the environment they were in? Here's what I'm asking. Like, I'm a huge fan of the NFL, right? And one of the things that really fascinates me is that you have these executives that have been in the league, 15, 20, 30 years, and they still mess up on draft picks. Like, league has been around for 100 years. Don't we know how to pick, young players? Well, some of them do, some of them don't, right? So the main thing there, and then one of my favorite coaches is Bill Belichick, all-time great. He always talks about competition. Like, you can have phenomenal numbers, but what was the competition? What was your environment that you were in, right? So do you look at that in any way, shape, or form? And how does that fit in your assessment when choosing an executive?
It's a really great angle on it. I would say not as much as I think I probably should after hearing your explanation of it. I think it's a good point. But I'll tell you what I do, which is an alternative, and I'm not saying it's better or worse. What did you inherit, and where did you leave it? And tell me about the journey between those two places. And what were the challenges, and how did you lead your team, and what resistance did you get from your team? Because if they can't give you specifics, it means they really weren't the ones driving it. And very quickly, like, if you ask a question to someone like, what was your starting revenue point? What was your ending revenue point? How did you achieve it? If they're in the detail, if they're all over it, they'll tell, like, boom. They'll just know it inside out.
With salespeople, you got to be a little bit careful. Sorry, Robert, because salespeople are good at selling themselves. So you kind of have to poke a little bit deeper into everything.
Yeah, this is true. But again, you can get below the surface level, I believe, in by saying, well, how'd you do it? What was the starting point? Like, tell me about your KPIs that you use. What's your governance policy? How do you do forecasting? What's your pipeline management routine? And by the way, there are plenty of good sales leaders who aren't particularly good on those kind of business systems that are just good in other ways, but it reveals itself pretty quickly.
Oh, yeah.
What about the relationship when you come into a new CEO role? On the outside, I'm thinking of people that take over in a crisis. One of my clients is Nike, and the previous CEO, the stock went from 170 to 70 in about a year of the company. A new CEO comes in. His name is Elliot Hill. And he's never been a CEO before, but he was a longtime employee of the company, started out as an intern. But I imagine when you're appointed to be the CEO of a company, you try to project unshakable confidence, courage in the face of the challenges, certainty But what do you feel on the inside? Do you ever feel lack
Are
of
you
confidence, uncertain, lack of courage?
scared?
How do you deal with those feelings?
So firstly, you're right on what you just say. No matter what is going on, it doesn't matter how rough a night's sleep you've had, how stressed you are, what's going on in your personal life. When you're on, you've got to lead and inspire your people in your body language and the way you project. And doesn't mean when things are clearly going badly, you say everything is going great, right? I mean, there is a demographic who responds well to that, but most will see through that. But to your point, no matter what's going on in your personal life, you project confidence and you project a vision and inspire your team. But no doubt, there are absolute moments where you do question yourself and you are unsure. Scared, not so scared, but certainly, imposter syndrome, I think, is a big thing for CEOs that they probably don't admit to.
Yeah.
Have I got it
Oh,
right? Those things cross your mind all the time. And I think that's a healthy mental process to be going through. I remember my rugby coach, going back to my rugby, sorry, it could be any sport. Before games, I would get nervous. No matter how good a player I was, and I was a pretty good player, I'd get nervous. And I remember him saying that it gets getting you in the right mental headspace for the game. That's a good thing. And I feel the same way in answering your question. I think if you are having those moments of doubt, that's a good thing because we're not perfect. We're not superstars. Often than not, we're just average intelligent CEOs who are good leaders, right? And I think if you have those moments of doubt, it's forcing you to reevaluate and to ask questions. Having said all that, when you've gone through that kind of mental process, when you get in the room with your team, there is not a shred of doubt. You're leading your team.
oh, okay. So it's like the jitters before the Super Bowl, but once you get on the field, the jitters go away.
For me, always, yeah. Like I don't walk into meeting rooms thinking like that. I mean, I'm not sure if other CEOs do, but I don't. But in my personal space, I do.
Yeah.
Well, sorry, Robert. It's a little bit of consequence. This is something that I notice every person who played team sports I would say on a level. I played basketball for over 10 years, right? Me coming from a basketball country, before you walk, you learn how to dribble and, behind your back and all of that, right? But before any game, I was scared, like, but the moment I stepped on the court, everything goes
Yeah.
away. Like
Yeah.
that, it was just, I don't know if it was the coaching or mental preparation or just me. But before the game, like I would just sit quietly. I would listen to my teammates. I would kind of absorb what is happening in our locker room. But I was so scared. Holy F, I'm going to let my teammates down. They're going to entrust me to make a shot and I'm going to miss it. All of these doubts are just piling up. But the moment I walk on the field, blank and fully focused.
Exactly. I feel the same way.
Yeah.
You mentioned something about coaching. Mario and I, our company's Masterful Coaching. I wrote a book called Masterful Coaching a number of years back, which disrupted traditional leadership development, business consulting, and coaching. But I wonder, so you valued coaching. Have you ever had a CEO coach to help you in those moments? Or do you feel that's not necessary for someone with your experience?
I think it's necessary. I do. I'm interested to hear from you guys if you hear this from other CEOs, but I found the further up my career I've gone, the less accessible it is to find mentors. And so it can be quite.
The harder it is to find mentors?
Yeah. Even when I was a general manager or a regional general manager, I had some really good mentorship. But obviously, when you get to the very top, the accessibility to that has reduced significantly. And so what's your checks and balances? What's your sounding board? It can be a partner, but really don't want to burden your partner with nonsense at work. It can be your team, but you've got to be very careful there, right? Because your team's there as a sounding board, but it's not a sounding board for your doubts and for your personal executive coaching. You possibly might get that from the board that you report to directly, possibly, but you've also got to be a little bit careful as well. So that's a long way of answering your question, which is to say, I think executive coaching or finding a mentor outside of your work, I think it's hugely beneficial, and I think most CEOs need it. I certainly benefit from it.
I was going to ask you, what is the biggest CEO job you've had? And that's a leading question. And where are you going from here?
I think it depends on how you measure it, but I've had CEO jobs that report directly to the boards. I've got CEO roles that do a top line of close to $300 million. I've had important CEO roles where it was quite a small business, but it was, high operating margins. So I've got reasonably good sized businesses.
That seems like a very inexplicit answer, but we'll let it go at that.
Since we are getting close to the end of the podcast, I just want to ask one more question that we tend to kind of forget, and that is the first 90 days or the first 100 days of a CEO's tenure, right? So we hear a lot about that, like our presidents, what will he or she do in the first 90 days or first 100 days, right? And then we have the address of the first 100 days, and we have the plan for the first 100, and so on. So there's a lot of emphasis on that. So what's your approach to the first 100 days of your tenure? And then kind of piggybacking on that, what would you advise other CEOs starting their role on the first 100 days of their tenure?
My view on the first 100 days is it's a very unique period that you'll never get again once it's gone. Like the ability to just ask stupid questions, be the new boy on the block, is there for a short amount of time. Now, there are some environments you walk into where you kind of have to hit the ground running, like it's a rescue job, it's a turnaround. Things are quite stressful, but more often than not, that first 100 days is your chance, your honeymoon period, and don't waste it. And so for me, it's all about learning. I spend a huge amount of time with customers. I really want to understand what drives value to them, both that they know about and they don't know about, right? Because you're trying to evolve the business model, where you're competitively positioned, your strengths, your weaknesses, your threats. I spend a huge amount of time with the employees as well. I mean, I spend a good amount of time learning about the products, but most of all, I spend it with the employees and with the customers, because that quickly informs what's going to be our operating model moving forward. What's going to be the step change? Where are the threats that we need to defend against, and where are the opportunities that we need to go after?
Very interesting. Well, I was going to ask you, I have a friend that he was itching to become the CEO of a public company. He didn't get that job, and he wound up working as a CEO for a private equity company. Do you have any thoughts about the pluses and minuses of working for a public company versus a private equity company as a CEO?
Yeah, I'm probably going to answer this question the same way I answered your last question, which is not to say one's better than the other or who's my favorite. But I will say, I don't overcomplicate the differences. I do think with a publicly traded company, you've got a lot more reporting to do. You've got a lot more compliance to do. It's a bit more rounded in terms of the way you look at ESG and DEI and employees and stuff like that at times. But I just focus on delivering results and communicating proactively and well to the board, whether it's private equity or publicly traded. And I think if you do those things, you're going to be fine either way. I think being a CEO of a publicly traded company brings with it some rewards, but also brings with it some complications. Like if you get an active investor group that want to change things and force your hand, that might not be favorable.
In the private equity, what about if someone is buying a company in order to sell it? Does that mean that they're going to be willing to make the long-term investment that's needed to bring the company to another level? And how does that impact your role as a CEO? Are you a hired gun, or are you a world game changer?
I think that the differences on that point between the two are closer than people think, actually, because a lot of the publicly traded companies are a lot more short-term thinking than I think they should be,
right?
And that they want to admit that they are. Right? So the amount of times you're talking about, I want to make a CapEx investment for reasons A, B, and C, or I want to do a site move or consolidation, it's got a good ROI, it makes all the sense in the world, but the payback might not be for 2 years' time or even 18 months' time. And so therefore, there's some focus on short-term results. And that's definitely the case in private equity, because to your point, they're buying it and they want to sell it within a 5-year period. So the cliche and certainly the surface level answer would be that publicly traded companies are more focused on long-term performance and private equity is not. I actually don't think there's that much of a difference in many cases. There are exceptions, of course, but generally I don't think there's that much difference.
Yeah, I think my friend got trapped working for a private equity organization and couldn't get out of it. He couldn't get to the next level once he got into the private equity game.
Robert, any last questions to David before we sign off?
Yes, I would think that David should write a book. Let me put on the coaching hat now. I think, David, what are your thoughts about building your personal brand and writing a book where you talk about your experiences at English boarding schools, training, being a CEO, and the 10 insights you learn from it. All you need is a good title. I don't think I'm wondering whether you should just go on to your next CEO job. This is my background conversation.
I think it's an interesting idea and question. I'd welcome more conversation and ideas on how to do it.
David, thank you so much for joining us today. Lovely conversation. Any last comments from your side? Any last message to, let's say, newly minted CEOs that you can kind of give them a little bit maybe of encouragement?
Yeah, don't think you have to know it all. Right.
I think that's one of the things that really came across well in what you said right from the beginning is listening, learning, and then taking action.
I think that's it. Like, don't think you have to be this actor constantly, both at home and with friends. Like, you don't know it all. It's okay not to know it all. Go look for the answers. You listen to your team, listen to your customers, and it will come to you.
Yeah. David, thank you so much. For everyone listening, this was the CEO Podcast. Again, I am your host, Mario, my partner and co-host, Professor Robert Hargrove. David, thank you so much for being a wonderful guest. Until next time, goodbye.